we're talking about the Brahma Viharas. Shaddai was talking about a workshop that's coming up, or a retreat that's coming up at Aryaloka, about the Brahma Viharas, the divine abidings, or sometimes they're called the immeasurable qualities. And they're all very helpful in terms of self-compassion. Yeah. So anyway, I wanted to do just a little meditation about, thoughts and feelings, maybe just to become a bit more aware of the connection between those things. Short meditation. So we can just settle in. And we're going to talk about feelings next. So soft eyes, kind eyes. Sitting with dignity. Upright and relaxed. Becoming aware of the parts of the body where our feelings tend to be most prominent. Pleasant and unpleasant feelings can manifest all over the body, but they can be particularly intense around the heart, the diaphragm, the gut. So being aware of that, and also at the same time with soft eyes, being aware of the space of the mind where thoughts arise. And by thoughts this time, I mean images, words. So seeing if you can just breathe with an awareness of both of these parts of you at the same time. Kind of feeling space and the thought space. And if no thoughts are arising, you might simply be aware of a sense of illumination, a feeling tone that's in the mind. And the feeling space is probably quite calm and maybe even pleasant. And just see if you can notice what happens to the feeling space when a thought happens to pass through the mind. Sometimes there's a little disturbance, like a hand reaching into a pond and stirring up some of the mud at the bottom of the pond. But I'm going to invite you to deliberately call into the mind certain thoughts and see what effect they have, just so we can be aware of this connection between thought and feeling. So it's not uncommon for there to be someone, maybe a politician, that we really don't like, can't stand. So maybe you could call to mind a person like that and really see clearly the things that they do that you don't like, that you react to. And just notice what happens in the feeling space. And how might you describe those changes? Is it tightness, darkness, cold, movement, pressure? And just seeing if you can regard whatever feelings arise with kindness, with acceptance. This is just how the mind and body responds in the presence of this particular person. Maybe you can offer yourself a little support, as well as the kindly regard. Maybe you can speak some words of support. It's okay. You're going to be okay. We can be with this. We can do this. And then just letting go of the image of that particular person. Maybe as a kind of mental cleanse, you can imagine fresh running water, maybe in a stream. Maybe that's more pleasant. Maybe that in itself has an effect on the feeling space. And then just imagine that a dear friend has shown up on your doorstep unexpectedly, maybe someone from far away that you haven't seen for a long time, and it's in a post-COVID world. So you can welcome them at the door. And your friend is delighted to see you. And just notice what arises in the feeling space now. And then I'm not going to ring a bell, but you can just start to become more aware of the space around you again. The light and the sound and the space. And bringing your attention more fully into the world as you allow the eyes to open. So yeah, feelings are interesting things. I used to regard them as quite mysterious. I had no idea what they were. It was almost like some kind of subtle substance. That's how I used to think of them, as like a subtle cloud-like substance, moving through the body. And I just think of them as internally generated sensations. That's what they are. The mind creates sensations in the body. Relatively ancient parts of the mind create these sensations. And the purpose of creating pleasant and unpleasant sensations in the body is to alert us to potential benefits and potential threats. So if we didn't have those feelings, it would be quite easy to ignore potential threats. Like say in our distant past or even now, walking into a dark forest. I mean, you can know intellectually that walking into a dark forest is a potentially hazardous thing to do. But unless you've got that kind of heartbeat, the unpleasant sense of the heartbeat and the knot of anxiety in your belly, you're going to be a bit too relaxed for your own comfort. So it's like ancient parts of the brain are creating these sensations to say, this is something you really need to pay attention to. And the same with pleasant feelings as well. When something good happens to us, when we're in the presence of someone with whom we have that kind of reciprocal relationship of care. If we didn't have any feelings about that, there would be nothing to stop us from drifting away from that relationship and from valuing that relationship. If we didn't have unpleasant feelings arising when there was a difficulty between us, then we wouldn't care about those difficulties. We wouldn't do anything to overcome them. Yeah, so we have all of these interesting sensations, pleasure, a sort of sense of warmth, opening, sometimes a pleasant kind of tingling, like Michael was talking about that behind the eyes. When things are unpleasant, like a knot of tension. If you think about disappointment, the sense of a sinking heart, I mean, it's almost a literal feeling of something dropping inside you. Or if someone says something that hurts your feelings, I mean, it really does hurt. It really does hurt your feelings. There's a sense of physical pain in the body. And, interestingly, they've done studies that show that if you take painkillers, like Tylenol in the US, I think it's, no, acetaminophen in the US, or paracetamol, I think, in most of the rest of the world. If you take that particular medicine, you don't feel as hurt. If for example, you're excluded. They've done studies where they've deliberately made people feel excluded or put them into a situation where they're excluded, and they feel less bothered about it if they've been taking painkillers. Well, also, you feel less pleasure as well. It's very sort of physical kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. But sometimes also coldness. The worst kind of unpleasant feeling I've ever had is like a kind of a writhing in the gut. It's very sort of Lovecraftian, if you're familiar with H.P. Lovecraft. It's like having tentacles writhing in your gut. It's the most unpleasant feeling I've ever had. Sometimes a sense of pressure, like frustration, for example, or it feels like, to me anyway, like this pressure building up inside of me that I have to let go of somehow. So we've got all these interesting sensations that arise. And here's the really crucial thing about them. There are no good or bad feelings. They can be pleasant or they can be unpleasant. But from a Buddhist point of view, they're not good or bad. They're just signals. They're just inner communications. And I'm going to talk about that process of communication later. They're just signals. Pay attention to this. This is a potential benefit. Pay attention to this. This is a potential threat. Those assessments may not be correct at all. Often they're wrong. We get misguided. We can have a knot of anxiety about talking to a stranger who's perfectly friendly, for example, or we get feelings of pleasure doing something that's addictive and destructive. So they can be very misleading, but in themselves, they're not good or bad. Buddhism talks about them as being the results of past karma. They're just the results of past conditioning, with past associations that you've made, and they happen quite automatically. You don't choose to have them. It's really interesting just to notice them as just sensations, because one of our big problems is that we think that certain feelings are bad and we've got to get rid of them. Maybe we think sometimes this is a bad feeling, so that makes me a bad person. So it's an unpleasant feeling, which we then describe as bad, and then we think of as part of us. So I must be a bad person, and that sets up a huge amount of reaction, a huge amount of self-blame. But they're just sensations. They're just inner communications, which I'm going to talk about a bit more. And I don't know if this has been done with what you can call like emotional feelings, these kinds of feelings that I've been talking about. But an experiment that's been done with physical discomfort, which is induced in a lab setting by, for example, putting a very hot heat patch on somebody's skin, not hot enough to actually burn them, but hot enough to be painful, or asking people to put a hand in a bucket of ice water. So they induce pain in the laboratory. And they found that people that have trained in mindfulness, when they look at their brains, the sensations are not being processed in the part of the brain that normally registers pain. By training ourselves to be aware of uncomfortable sensations, just in very ordinary terms of, well, this feels like pressure, this feels like heat, this feels like shrinking. By training ourselves to regard painful sensations in that way, the sensations actually seem to get shunted to a different part of the brain, the part of the brain that deals with ordinary sensations. And so we don't experience pain as pain. It's a really interesting discovery. And as I say, I don't know if that's been done with like these kind of more emotional feelings, but I'm pretty sure they are, because that's been my experience as well. Sometimes I turn toward an unpleasant feeling, and I realize there's nothing really particularly unpleasant about it. It's just a bunch of tingling sensations, pressure, warmth, cold, movement. And it's like your brain is now translating the feeling as those kind of qualities, rather than this is something painful, this is something I want to get rid of. So if we train ourselves to regard feelings just as sensations, then we react to them a lot less. It's one of the most self-compassionate things that we can do. And it's very counterintuitive to turn toward pain in that way. It's like our evolutionary history created pain as an aversive mechanism. And it created, emotional pain as an aversive mechanism as well. This thing is unpleasant. I should get away from it. The pain itself is unpleasant. So therefore I should try to get away from it. I should get away from whatever's causing it, and I should try to get away from the pain. So it takes a kind of an act of faith and courage to turn toward painful feelings in that way. But it's a very, very rewarding thing to do. So I've been, working through this process, recognizing that we're in pain, which often is simultaneous with realizing that we're caught up in a story and that we need to let go of the story. And that allows us, those two things together, recognizing that we're suffering, recognizing that there's a story and that we need to drop it, allows us to turn toward painful feelings, and we can see them. We can allow them to be there. We can see them just as sensations. But I mentioned that they're communications, and that's important as well. Someone in the comments, Mary McCutcheon, commented with a quote from Rainer Maria Rilke: "Our deepest fears are like dragons guarding our most precious treasure." That's really fantastic. Rilke said something else. He said, "Perhaps everything terrifying is deep down a helpless thing that needs our help." And I think we can start off like terrified by our unpleasant feelings. And so we want to get away from them. We want to get rid of them. We want to get away from or punish or push away through some aversive mechanism, the supposed external cause of this unpleasant feeling. And so we're terrified of them. It's a terrifying thing. We want to get rid of them. But what's giving rise to that terrifying feeling is a helpless thing that needs our help. So that brings us on to the fourth stage, that these feelings are an expression of a part of us that's in a state of fear or distress, and it needs support. There's some part of you that is struggling, and it's reaching out for help, and it's communicating through producing these unpleasant sensations, and it needs your help. So I talked about 3 ways that we can do that. There's kind eyes. And that's really important. I think sometimes we have this like cold, hard stare as we're going into the body. We're being aware of ourselves, and it's in a slightly kind of, even if it's in a neutral way, a neutral gaze is perceived as threatening. This is again something that psychologists do. If they want to make someone feel stressed, they put you in front of a panel while you're speaking, and the panel will look at you. That's all they do. They look at you, but they've been trained not to give any reaction. They don't smile, they don't nod, nothing. They're looking at you in a neutral way. And it induces intense anxiety. This is why it's a stress test. It induces this intense anxiety in people who are being looked at with a neutral gaze. So we interpret even a neutral gaze as being threatening. So maybe this is why sometimes our feelings don't want to show themselves when we're looking inside of ourselves. Unless our inner gaze actually has that sort of sense of warmth and kindness to it, it can be, I think, perceived as being hostile. So kind eyes is really important, and just coming back to that and training ourselves to do that over and over again. It's really important, just building that up as a skill. And then there's supportive words, inner self-talk. So we've got the metta phrases, for example, loving kindness phrases or compassion phrases, where we can talk to ourselves or talk to the part of us that's suffering. And that's sometimes why I use second person language rather than, may I be well, may I be happy. May you be well, may you be happy. There's something for me that it feels like I'm talking to a specific part of myself. I'm talking to the specific part of me that's suffering. And sometimes I use third person. So may we be well, may we be happy, because we're all in it together. There's all these different parts of us, different components of us, relating to the world in different ways with different levels of awareness, and we're all in it together. if one part of us is suffering, it affects all of us. So, may we be well, may we be happy. I find that much more helpful than saying, may I. And sometimes just natural language. I do this in the Metta Bhavana practice, and with all of the people who are in the loving kindness practice. Traditionally, we cultivate loving kindness toward ourselves, a friend, a so-called neutral person, a relative, stranger, and someone we have conflict with. And I'll sometimes fall into using natural language, which I've illustrated a little bit. Just things like, there's a part of me that's suffering. I'm saying, yeah, I know this is hard right now. I know this is difficult, but it's all right. We're going to get through this. And maybe I'm suffering because I'm feeling embarrassed or something like that. And so I'll offer some reassurance about that. I'll say, it's okay. Everyone makes mistakes. We all misjudge situations sometimes. There's no need to torture yourself about this. And so I'm just having this natural, fluid kind of conversation with myself. And to some extent, that turns into a sort of a rote thing, because the metta phrases are rote. They're things that we repeat, and that doesn't devalue them. They can be very useful. They can really work, even if we're doing them in a rote kind of a way. And then if we explore communicating with ourselves in more natural language, we'll sometimes find particular patterns of word, particular things that we say to ourselves that are helpful. They resonate. They're useful. They work. They help make the suffering parts of us feel more at ease. And so you find that you start using those phrases over and over again, and that's great. You've chosen those phrases because they work for you. So just keep using them for as long as they work for you. So there's kind eyes, there's supportive words, which can either be like the rote metta phrases, the kindness, loving kindness phrases, or natural language. And there's supportive touch, which I find can be really useful as well. The discomfort that we're experiencing is usually manifesting quite strongly in one part of the body, depending on where it is. If I'm feeling sad, it's usually around about the heart. If I'm feeling anxious, it's usually down in the solar plexus, for example. So just placing a hand there, and the hand, you can do all three of these things together. So you're regarding yourself kindly, and you're saying the phrases, and it's all. I sometimes imagine almost that the phrases like running down through my hand and carrying love, carrying kindness into the part of me that is suffering. And so there's two kinds of communication going on here. It's happening in two directions. You've got a part of you that is suffering, a part of you that's struggling, and it's making itself known through painful feelings. And then you're talking to the source, or to the apparent source of those painful feelings, the location of those painful feelings, offering kindness and reassurance in reaching back to the part of you that's communicating. So it's a sort of two-way form of communication. And we'll do a meditation to close, but I just want to say, so many things I want to say, actually. I'll have to be very selective. I want to talk about the gap, because that's important. Those of you that are familiar with Buddhist terminology will often hear about the gap. There's a gap between the terms might change, but there's a gap between feeling and responding to that feeling. There's a gap between feeling and volition. So feelings are received. They're patterns of sensation we have in the body. They're giving us signals about potential threats, potential benefits. And then there's what the mind does, this thought movement, this volitional movement. What is it doing? Is it pushing away? Is it trying to pull something toward us? Is it accepting? Is it loving? If we can be aware of, so there's sorry, I'll just go back one little bit. There's a gap, potentially a gap between feeling and our volition. So often what happens is that we're just very habitual. An unpleasant thing happens, our feelings get hurt, and we do something like, maybe we lash out at the other person, or maybe we go into criticizing ourselves. We blame them, or we blame ourselves. So that's very habitual, unpleasant feeling, blame. There is a potential gap there between the feeling and the response. That if we're mindful, we don't have to have that habitual response of blame. If we're mindful, we can just be aware of the feeling, and then we can choose to have another kind of volition. We can choose to have the volition to be kind to ourselves because we're suffering. We can choose to have the volition to be curious with the person that has maybe said or done the thing that's hurt us, and talk to them about that. And a lot of the time people think that this, I used to think this way for a long time, that the gap between feeling and response was this tiny moment. And if you didn't catch it before the response, before the reaction started, you'd missed it. And it seemed like this almost impossible task. Maybe at some distant time in the future, you would be able to catch this moment before the reaction started, and therefore be freed from that reaction. And that's not how it works. The gap is something you create by taking attention to the feeling. So it's not a moment in time. As soon as you take your attention to the feeling, you're taking attention away from your reactions, from the part of your mind that's reacting. And you're back you're in the feeling. And you realize now you're mindful of the feeling, you're aware of the sensations, and you're now aware that you have a choice about how you respond to that particular feeling. You've got mindfulness. So even though the reaction has already started, someone has scared you, you've immediately got angry with them. That happens. You've already reacted. And then you realize, oh, hang on, underneath this anger is a feeling of fear and hurt. Let me be aware of that. And from that moment, you've created a gap where you can respond differently. So that response, as I mentioned, self-compassion is one of those responses. Triggering a kindly gaze, triggering kindly words, kindly touch. You can do all of that for yourself in the gap. And as well as being a kind of a way of being, this gap, as well as it being a way of being, a way of relating in which you can be more at peace with yourself and you can be more creative in the way that you respond, it's also a kind of a space through which wisdom can arise. Because when we're reacting, we don't really have any wisdom. We can't respond wisely. We usually do unhelpful, stereotypical patterns of behavior, which cause suffering for others and cause suffering for ourselves. But when we pause, when we've been mindfully and compassionately aware of our suffering, there's a kind of creative space in which we're free to kind of consider, hey, how am I going to speak right now? Am I going to speak in a way that's compassionate, that's curious, that's trying to get to the bottom of this, that's going to maybe just sort of say, honestly, I felt a little hurt when you said that. And I'm wondering, what was in your mind? So we have this opportunity as soon as we become mindful of our feelings for, a different way of being to arise. And sometimes, and this brings us back to something that somebody asked earlier on, I can't remember who it was, about changing the interpretive patterns that give rise to our feelings in the first place. Because we all have these patterns, these habitual patterns deeply ingrained into us. So I mentioned, for example, that as a result of childhood conditioning, I sometimes, wonder whether people care about me. Even people that do care about me, I sometimes wonder whether they care about me, and they'll do certain things like, I don't know, not hear me when I'm speaking to them, or not taking into account something that I'm doing. Close a door that I'm just about to walk through, or to reach through into a closet to get something. And so I'll just experience this, and that filter kicks in. It's like, I don't matter. So as soon as we start practicing mindful self-compassion in this way, we have an opportunity to recognize, hey, okay, so that's interesting. Why did I respond in this particular way? Why was I so triggered by that thing that happened? And we start to become, more aware of our own conditioning. And just in bringing that conditioning into awareness and being compassionate to that part of us, it starts to weaken a little bit. And the rest, I think, I'll just have to leave for now. There's other things I wanted to say. I wanted to say something about self-compassion without a self. Let's just do that in 2 sentences. We tend to think of ourselves as having a self, so that we're unitary. We are one thing, but you are not one thing. You are many different things. You're many different components, many different parts of your brain, many different systems, all working, sometimes in ways that help you. They certainly, keep you alive from day to day, but sometimes in ways that cause you, emotional suffering. So just, letting go of this idea that there's a unitary self. In fact, this practice of self-compassion helps us to let go of the idea that there's a unitary self. We realize, oh, there's this part of me that's generating these feelings. Oh, there's this part of me that's compassionate. Oh, there's this part of me that's lashing out. We see all these different parts of ourselves, and we realize they're not all one. So it's very helpful to recognize that and break down this sense of a unitary self. Because when we think that we only have one self, that there's this thing here that we call a self, we, immediately you start to wonder, well, what kind of self is it? Is it good or is it bad? Is it competent or is it not very good at stuff? Is it doing okay at life or is it making a real mess? And we think in those kind of like binary qualities about what kind of self we've got, and we end up, getting into a lot of self-blame. But ultimately, what it comes down to is that pain deserves a compassionate response. And it's not our pain. We don't judge ourselves. It's not that you're weak or there's something wrong with you because you're in pain. There's just pain. And it's not really your compassion either. It's just, compassion just responds to pain. And it doesn't matter where that pain is. If the pain is in somebody else, the appropriate response is compassion. And you find that the more you let go of this sense of, a unitary self, the more there's just this sense of, compassion just flows wherever it's needed. So anyway, I said I was going to say that in 2 sentences and I didn't. So let's just do a little meditation to round off, and then we can have just an opportunity to maybe say goodbye. So let's just for one last time today, just allow ourselves with the eyes closed to have soft eyes, kind eyes. And with soft eyes, becoming aware of your whole being. And just saying to yourself words accompanying this kind gaze upon yourself. May we be well. May we be at peace. All these different parts of us. And may we be kind to ourselves and each other. And I'm going to invite you to open your eyes to the screen that's in front of you and continuing to be aware of yourself, of your own body, your own feelings, your own mind, but also aware of all these beings in front of you. And again, just saying, may we be well, meaning all of us. May we be at peace. May we be kind to ourselves and each other. Just sitting with a kindly gaze. And then I'm going to recite a few words and I'll leave a gap. We can't really chant together on Zoom because of time delays, but I'm going to recite some words. It's a modification of verses that some of you will know, some of you that are involved in Triratna Buddhism. So I'll leave a gap after each sentence just so you can, or each phrase, so that you can repeat it after me. May the skillful qualities arising from this period of practice go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings. My personality throughout my existences, my possessions, and my skillful qualities of body, speech, and mind, I make available without regard for myself, for the benefit of all beings. Just as the earth and other elements are serviceable in many ways to the infinite number of beings inhabiting limitless space, so may I become that which supports all beings, situated throughout space, so long as all have not attained to peace.